Good morning, good afternoon, perhaps good evening. It really doesn't matter as usual. Welcome to the Hoodie Files. This is episode 4, The Road to War. Talking about the start of World War I this evening. I got my hoodie on. I'm very relaxed. Got my ball cap. I hope you're doing the same. Hope you got a big old pile of cupcakes or perhaps some chocolate ice cream. You can snack on that or chew bubble gum, whatever you want. But let's go ahead and get started. I just want to make it clear to you that what I'm talking about, all the material comes from the textbook and is the study guide. Everything for this project originates from there. And you can find all this information in the textbook, page 826 through 830. But the point is not to give you a recap of the entire textbook. The point tonight is to hit on a couple of, I guess you would say, points or terms that are a little bit harder to understand just from straight reading. So looking at the basic topics as you go through the chapter, this I guess over the weekend here, it starts off with the idea of collective security. So we start off with kind of a theoretical view of the post-World War I situation. Then we're going to look at some peripheral conflicts that led to World War II. A couple of things outside of the mainstream that took us right into the actual World War II offensive. Then we get the idea of Hitler when he has some ideas for expansion and how he turns those ideas into action. And finally, we're going to finish up with another theory, which is the idea of appeasement. Of these four things, really, collective security, peripheral conflicts, and appeasement are the trickiest ones. Appeasement is probably the most important term that I'd like you to focus on. So let's just start back at the beginning. It's a very good place to start. Remember from earlier that the 1930s were really kind of bad times for all. We had grown and grown and grown in the 1920s. 1930s saw bad times for all. Everybody did, of course, see the rise of these dictators. You had Mussolini, you had Hitler, had a lot of things that were making people very nervous. The United States, Britain, and France, they all agreed that something had to be done to contain the Nazis, to contain the fascists, but they could not agree on exactly what must be done to protect common interests. This happens all the time in international relations, and you see it in modern-day politics now. Most people across the world agree that something must be done about global warming, or at least something must be done about the environment, to put it in broad terms. But countries can't come to an agreement about exactly what must be done. This goes back to the very first thing we talked about in the very first week of class, where the world itself is living in an anarchy. And so every country has its own interest. And even though some of these interests are aligned, United States, Britain, and France all agreed something had to be done, exactly what is very, very difficult to coordinate on the international scale. When you couple the need for collective security and the confusion about how to get collective security with some of the peripheral conflicts, you see that we had some real, I guess, hotbed of activity potentially leading into World War II. Now, by peripheral conflicts, what I really mean here is these are conflicts that are outside of the sort of the mainstream. I don't want to say the first world, because Japan and China are very, very important players in the world scene. But when you start talking about the European scene, and you have Britain, France, and the United States is somewhat part of that European scene, all of these conflicts are around the edges. Japan and China, it dealt with the League of Nations, but it didn't directly affect Europe. Italy attacking Ethiopia and trying to set up a colony. Again, it affects the League of Nations, and the League of Nations actually tries to issue some sanctions. I'll go back to that in a minute. But it still isn't right in Europe, and it still doesn't really bring people to the need for a actual common action collective security. And finally, the Spanish Civil War. You had an internal struggle between fascists or nationalists and basically communists, although your book's really going to refer to them as Republicans, and there's a very subtle difference what's going on there. But the Germans came in to help the fascists because they're very focused on supporting any nationalism any way they can find it. And the Russians come in to support the Republicans, and that's why I go ahead and call them communists, because the Republicans here were trying to get all the power to the people and transfer land from some of the rich landholders down to the common person. So it's the very same idea that the Russians had seen in their revolution. Okay. Now, let me take you just back to one idea that I do want to touch on, this idea of sanctions. And I would like you to spend a few minutes in the book looking at this. Sanctions are when something like the League of Nations, or in today's parlance you have the United Nations, they all come to some agreement to vote and try to agree that nobody is going to sell certain goods or trade certain goods with another country. So they basically try to convince another country, in this case Italy, to stop what they're doing, in this case attacking Ethiopia, by saying, until you stop what you're doing, we're not going to sell you the grain you need, or the batteries, or the oil, or the steel. Now, this was not oil and steel in this particular instance, and that's one of the reasons it broke down. But you see sanctions all over the world today. I mean, it's a very powerful weapon. It's one of the only weapons that the United Nations has at its disposal now. But the League of Nations certainly tried to employ that weapon. Hitler, talking about his sort of theoretical reasons for going on the offensive, goes all the way back to his autobiography, which we saw before the midterm, Mein Kampf. In this, as part of this, he wrote that only an adequate large space on this earth assures a nation freedom of existence. We must hold unflinchingly to our aim, to secure for the German people the land and soil to which they are entitled. What you see here is that Germany is being led by Hitler, who feels that there's almost what you might call a manifest destiny, a destiny for their people, that the world is owed to them. And so when Hitler goes on the offensive, he is just fulfilling what he sees as his and his nation's birthright. He sees nothing wrong with trying to expand. So what does he do? Well, there's a couple of steps. You're going to read about all of these in the book, but what you see is the first thing he does is he goes after the area known as the Rhineland. We saw this after the Treaty of Versailles even. It was set up as a buffer state between France and Germany. He takes that. Then he moves into Austria, just south of Germany. Why does he do this? Because he feels that there are Germans down there in Austria. They speak the same languages, they share the same blood, and therefore they should share the same Reich or empire in his view. Finally, he goes into Czechoslovakia in this small area called Sudetenland. Again, you'll read about this in your book. But there's a couple of areas here that have a very strong German minority. Now, so I know that's a contradiction in term, but there's a lot of German speakers, a lot of German ethnic peoples living in Czechoslovakia, and Hitler believes, again, it's his manifest destiny to take that. So with all of these steps, Germany expands very quickly and immediately threatens France, right on the border with France, and France already doesn't trust Germany. This goes all the way back to pre-World War I, okay? And threatens the rest of the country of Czechoslovakia, which goes along here. We're going to see that he's going to move into Czechoslovakia very quickly. Once he takes Czechoslovakia, all of this now provides huge threats to Poland. So by these short, small, quick expansions, he threatens France, he threatens Czechoslovakia, and the Polish people definitely see that they are going to be next. And with the Polish people being threatened, immediately now you're looking at all of the threats to Russia. So Germany is sitting on top of a powder keg, and they are lighting the fuse because Hitler believes it is the Germans' manifest destiny to expand beyond what borders have been assigned to them in the Treaty of Versailles. Very, very important to keep in mind that the Treaty of Versailles created so many conflicts that lead to World War II. This goes to the question of how does World War II really just a product of World War I? The key term that I want to wrap up with is this idea of appeasement. All along when Hitler is expanding, people are essentially letting him do this. And by people, I mean Britain, the United States, France. When he goes into Rhineland, people say, it's not really that big a deal. It's just a buffer zone. We can deal with this. No big deal, right? When he goes into Austria, people justify it by saying, well, he's really just uniting a bunch of German speakers, and maybe he's got a point that they should be under the same flag anyway. When he hits Czechoslovakia, they really start to just give ground. Say, well, we'll let him have a part of Czechoslovakia. This will make him happy, and perhaps he'll stop there. Perhaps he'll go away if we just keep making him happy. We all know this doesn't work. Anytime you're facing a bully, if you give him an inch, he takes a mile. That's what Hitler does. You see this every day in the real world. When somebody makes you upset, one of your natural instincts is to say, you know what, I'm just going to ignore it this time or next time or even 3 times. Eventually they'll get tired and they'll stop doing whatever it is. Hitler, unfortunately, never got tired of doing what he was doing because he saw the whole world as something that belonged to the German people. So, these are a couple of very basic ideas, but they can be complicated, and I wanted to make sure we spent a few minutes talking about them. Again, I refer you to your textbook, pages 826 and 830, for specific answers on how to work with the study guide. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to email me or talk to me in class. We got a long weekend up ahead, and I would like us to use the time wisely to be ready for all the quizzes and the research projects coming up. Kept it under 10 minutes. I thank you. Have a good afternoon, a good evening, and I'll see you in class.